We really need a tech staff here with us, but we are recording now. So welcome to the last of our 3 presentations in our Science of Reading overview series. And in this presentation, we want to examine why the science of reading is important and how we can begin to incorporate it into our practice. If you haven't attended or watched the recordings of our first 2 sessions in this series, you may want to do that before watching this one, because the earlier presentations cover some explanations of what we mean by the term science of reading, and we've also examined the strands found in the conceptual model of the reading rope. So my name is Mary Newton. I am the president of Reading League Wisconsin, and I'm presenting today along with our vice president, Amy McGovern. If you're just starting your Science of Reading journey, I think you'll soon discover that it's a very welcoming and sharing community, and you'll make many personal as well as professional friends. Amy and I live in different parts of Wisconsin and probably would not have crossed paths at all if it were not for our interest in letters training back in 2012 and 2013, where we both wanted to learn more about science of reading. And since then, we've collaborated on a lot of different reading issues, and now we're working together on Reading League Wisconsin. So we hope that as you go and continue your journey in science of reading, that you build many professional and personal friendships as well. Amy?
Thanks, Mary. Many of us were drawn to the science of reading because we came across a child, perhaps even our own, who simply could not crack the code and learn to read. So we went in pursuit of how we could help them. And for years, we lived in these isolated pockets. But I'm happy to say that those days are over. There are now so many outlets available to connect with this ever-growing community of science of reading educators. So we invite you to join one of our many excellent online platforms to continue your learning and help make connections. On Facebook, there's several great groups, including the Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, as well as a group specifically dedicated to kindergarten and first grade called the Science of Reading Kindergarten and First Grade Discussion Group, appropriately. So please do join in the conversation. There's so many great friends you can meet, and it's just a breath of fresh air to have this great community around us now, when so long we were in our own little tunnels and our own little world. Do join the Reading League Wisconsin as well, and of course our parent organization, the Reading League National. Okay, on to the work.
All right, so we have used these particular primary sources. These are sources that we consulted in preparing this presentation. We use the Data Explorer from the 2019 administration of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. We used a video of Stanislaus Dehaene, who is the winner of the Brain Prize. We have viewed, there are many interesting interviews on a website called Children of the Code, where the website administrator has interviewed many reading researchers. We've used Wisconsin Reading Coalition for analysis of reading proficiency data in Wisconsin, and we've used the podcast At a Loss for Words by Emily Hanford that you can locate on, if you go to the APM website and search for Emily Hanford. She has an excellent podcast on reading. And then we've used the Structured Literacy Primer from the International Dyslexia Association. So in this presentation, we want to consider, we want to go beyond what we did in our first 2 presentations. We want to look at more than just what the science of reading is. We want to look at why it's important for us to learn about it. And we're going to start out looking at why reading is so important to students and why their success is so important to teachers and society. And after we look at that, we'll take a brief look at data, reading data for Wisconsin from the 2019 National Assessment of Educational Progress. From this point forward, I will just refer to that as the NAEP. and see how close we are to maximizing the potential of our students. And if you're from a different jurisdiction, don't worry about it. I think the same principles apply for you to analyze your own state data. And then finally, we're going to look at 3 commonly used instructional approaches to teach reading and discuss which approach aligns best with the science of reading. So we're interested in knowing whether you have, sorry, Amy.
Sorry, my bad. Okay.
So we're interested in knowing whether you've begun to implement the science of reading in your classroom or your district. And so Amy's going to work on getting a poll.
I'm in the wrong spot.
We're going to get right on the right slide here.
Got in the wrong presentation completely. Bounced me out. I answered a question in the chat. That was a mistake. I'm sorry. We're going to have to wait on answering questions in the chat. Help each other. Learning is helping each other.
There you go, right there.
Okay, so
Amy's going to send out a poll. We just want to know not how much you know about science of reading, but have you begun to implement it in your classroom, your school, your district, whatever whatever in the environment is where you have control over what you do. So if you take a moment and give us some feedback on that, that will be very helpful. So you can see the first question is basically, where are you on your journey of implementing the science of reading in whatever setting you personally have control over? So your district might not be very far in the journey, but in your classroom, you might be down the road. And then we just asked a second question to go along with that, which is, what is the setting in which you have control over teaching reading? Hopefully you have some control in one of these areas. When we end the polling, Amy will share the results with us.
We're still getting responses.
Yeah. I know sometimes it's really frustrating when you have keyed into the importance of science of reading and you're all gung-ho to do it, and then you're just working in an environment where it's difficult for you to do that.
Okay, we're almost at 90%, Mary.
Okay.
Stop there. Okay, so we'll share the results.
Alrighty.
And happy to see that this is a group who's just beginning. We've got about 44% and that who've identified that they're just beginning their journey in the science of reading. So welcome. We're very happy that you're with us today. And also take the time to go back and review those other 2 presentations from today slowly and stop on the parts you're stuck on. Listen to them more than once to help you move forward. It's a lot to take in. We totally get that.
Let me say I empathize with that 1% that says you're beginning, but you're encountering too much resistance to make progress. And that's just, it's an unfortunate situation. And at least we have our professional communities to help support each other.
Yeah, and it's okay to be stuck. We get that. So hopefully you'll get some ideas. Or if you're ready for that next thing, hopefully you'll leave today's session with some ideas on where you can go next. So where do you have control? Most of you have control with your students, 100% agree. And really, you always have control with what you're doing with your students. So be empowered to make those small changes that can have such tremendous impact. Grade level, school. Okay. All right, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you for sharing, we appreciate it.
Yeah, it's always interesting information. So the first thing we want to look at is why reading is important for students. So we have several different reasons why it is an important topic to look at. First of all, reading, as we all know, is our gateway to all other academic learning. It's our primary way of acquiring advanced vocabulary and becoming more familiar with complex sentence structures. And in fact, most of our vocabulary after 4th grade, we acquire through reading, not through listening. It builds 3 different kinds of intelligence. It builds crystallized intelligence, which is our knowledge of stuff, right? We read about things to gain more knowledge. It helps build our fluid intelligence, which is our reasoning ability, and it helps build our emotional intelligence, gaining empathy and understanding for other individuals and other situations. It is essential for life success. Reading is needed both on and off the job to navigate society successfully, especially in the 21st century. We no longer have those jobs where you just don't need to learn to read at all. And then, because reading is the primary job of young children, where they're just at that stage where they're developing their self-concept, being successful at reading helps them build a positive self-concept and emotional health. And then for children who have been exposed to trauma, learning how to read, according to Don Michaelbaum from the Melissa Institute, is an important mechanism for ameliorating the fallout of trauma. So it's something that can assist us in helping kids with trauma overcome that. Okay, so Amy's going to go over.
Here we are. Yep.
There, yeah. Why reading is not just important to the student, but why is it important to the teacher to have proficient readers?
Right. So a thorough, whoopsies, sorry, I'm navigating 2 screens and on our 3rd presentation, so I'm a little punchy now. Here we go. A thorough understanding of the structure of English and how the brain learns to read helps educators reach all children we serve. So it's very important that we have that reading knowledge behind us. It builds satisfaction in realizing that the effort we put into learning how to be successful reading teachers and meeting with our children every day is matched by successful student outcomes in the classroom. That relationship building is really, if you know John Hattie's work, it is extremely high. I think it's 0.71 effect size, the relationship the teacher has with the student. So your knowledge base and pushing forward what you know about how to teach reading and the depth of knowledge that you bring to the table can certainly only accentuate that relationship building with children. And finally, there are a number of studies that have shown that pre-service teacher education programs really don't do a very good job of preparing our educators to teach reading. And I know that's a sensitive subject. I've worked with countless brand new teachers in my previous position, and I'll continue to do in this current position that I have. So it's especially noticeable in the area of word recognition. That domain of word recognition is a weakness for new teachers coming in. They know a lot about comprehension strategies and they know a little bit about word recognition, but not enough to really meet all the needs of their students. So individual educators and school systems need to realize that ongoing and in-depth professional learning in the area of reading has to be a high priority. And I know that's hard in a big district, even in a small district when there are so many initiatives coming at us all the time. How do you keep reading instruction at the forefront? So reading is really rightly seen as both a public health issue and a civil rights issue. Families with means can seek outside help when a child is unsuccessful in school. But moderate and low-income families do not always have that same option. And so in order to maintain equity across all of our schools nationwide, we need to provide all students with the best reading instruction possible in school. Low literacy has been shown to be a drag on the state and on the national economy, as individuals are unable to maximize their potential in contributing to the workforce. Likewise, many studies have shown that healthcare dollars are wasted, oftentimes due to low literacy levels in their patients. Low literacy levels lead to problems with patients complying with the protocols needed to get healthy. You know, they send you home with that big list of directions on what to do after you've had a procedure done. If your literacy levels are low, you're kind of in trouble on navigating that advice. Many adults cannot read and comprehend the directions given to them by their nurses and doctors, causing all kinds of problems for them down the road. Reading is a primary way we become informed of current events, to be active participants in our system of government. Even registering to vote and maneuvering through the voting process requires literacy skills. Low literacy is linked with a full range of social problems as well, from substance abuse to teen pregnancy to school dropout rates to juvenile offenses. It's also linked to adult involvement with the criminal justice system. Finally, low literacy is linked to poverty, often extending over generations, impacting countless children and their families.
So,
kind of a depressing view. We're going to lighten it up. Here we go.
okay, all right. So we know that reading is important to the individual, to the teacher, to society for so many different reasons. And so now we want to look at how are our students in Wisconsin performing in reading. We're looking at Wisconsin data, but I hope that those of you from out of state will think about about the trends in your own data. We understand the importance of reading proficiency, but if our students are generally performing proficiently already, then there really isn't any urgent need for any change in our current practices. So we're going to look at the NAEP results to see whether we think that we are at a satisfactory level of proficiency or not. The NAEP,
Mary?
Yep.
Be sure the NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, in case you're unfamiliar with that acronym.
I said that once before. I said, from now on, I'm using NAEP. So it's a mouthful.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you for that reminder. So the reason that we are using the NAEP is that it's the only assessment that allows us to compare different jurisdictions in our country using the same measurement standards. So here is a line graph, and this shows Wisconsin's national ranking on the NAEP for fourth grade reading from 1992 on the left through the most recent administration of the test in 2019 on the right. Massachusetts is represented in blue, Wisconsin is represented in red, and Florida is represented in yellow. And we can see that over that time period, Massachusetts has maintained a top rating for many years, while Florida has climbed up substantially in rank. Wisconsin scores have the actual score, the actual scale score has only declined slightly since 1992, but our ranking has slipped pretty dramatically. And that's because other states have started doing better and we have lagged behind here. So in addition to national ranking, we also want to look at the percentage of students who fall into the 4 proficiency categories of reading: advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic. Because if most of our students are reading at a proficient or advanced level, even if we rank 30th or 35th in the country, it's not really going to matter that much. I mean, we're not going to be too concerned about it. If everybody does very well in the nation and we just don't rank at the very top, it's not critical. So we want to look here to see how our students are doing. And unfortunately, we don't have the case where 90 or 95% of our kids are reading proficiently. On average in Wisconsin, if you look in the top row, the pie graph at the left, in Wisconsin, we have, on average, combining all our students across the state, 9% of our fourth graders read at an advanced level. 27% read at a proficient level, 30% at a basic level, and 34% at below basic. So that pie chart on the left, green is advanced, yellow is proficient, red is basic, black is below basic. And we can see moving from that average, the pie chart representation of average performance in Wisconsin, if we move across the rest of that row and across the bottom row, we're looking at individual subgroups of students. And what we see in the pie is that black below basic piece of the Wisconsin pie, and those are the students we really worry about. It continues to grow. And that's similar to the nation as a whole. So it's always a good first step to look at average student performance in a state, but then you need to go deeper and look at various groups of substudents. So in Wisconsin, we actually look best when we just compare our average student performance to the average student performance in other states. And that's because Wisconsin benefits demographically from having relatively more students who fall into the traditionally higher performing groups, and we have fewer students in our state who traditionally fall into the lower performing groups. So this helps our overall average compared to states that have higher percentages of students who are at higher risk. To a certain extent, that masks the true picture of how different subgroups of students are actually performing in our state compared to subgroup peers in other parts of the country. So I hope that makes sense to you, that just looking at an average, because different states' populations are made up differently, it's going to influence their average score results. So if we move now across the top row, after the Wisconsin average, we see the performance for white students, then Asian students, then Hispanic students. And then the second row, moving from left to right, we have lower socioeconomic students, English language learners, Black students, and students with disabilities. And as you can see, as we move through these groups, that black below basic piece of the pie grows larger with each group. Our Black students and our disabled students in Wisconsin have more than twice the percentage of students at below basic as our state average does and as our white students do. 1/3 of all students in Wisconsin are reading below basic. And among white students, it's 27%. That's still way too high, right? 27% of students reading at below basic. Among Hispanic students, though, it's 47% below basic. Low-income students, it's 51%. Black students, it's 69%. And students with disabilities, it's 74% reading at a below basic level. There's some other valuable information we can gain from the NAEP Data Explorer. First, none of our Wisconsin subgroups outperforms the national average for their subgroup. Our Black students in Wisconsin are last among Black students in all jurisdictions in the country. Our gap between Black students and white students is the largest in the country. Our white students may look good compared to some of our other subgroups of students, but they perform significantly below the national average for white students. They rank 34th in the nation for white students. Non-economically disadvantaged white students, those are white students who do not live in poverty, those students in Wisconsin rank 40th in the country. Many of our subgroups are 1 to 3 years behind their peers in other states. So I don't want this to be too depressing, but you can see that we definitely have some work to do. And other states, when you look at your NAEP results, you can see, where you stand too. So I always say it's a challenge, but challenge presents opportunity, right? So let's let Amy talk about that.
Right, so we are going to bring this up to a hopeful level, we promise. So what do we need to do to boost reading achievement in all students? Where are those unmet needs? Nancy Young's reading ladder shows us that roughly 40% of our students will learn to read fairly well, regardless of the type of instruction they receive. This corresponds pretty closely to the 36% of students in Wisconsin who achieve at the proficient or advanced level. However, the other 60% are falling behind because they have not because they have a need for code-based, explicit, systematic instruction that's not being met. A disproportionate number of students of color and of low socioeconomic status fall in the underserved population, creating profound equity issues. But make no mistake, there are children in every classroom across the country who are struggling to learn to read. The difference is that many children who come from families with means can afford tutoring service. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why should any child have to receive after-school tutoring in order to learn to read? And what happens to those children who cannot afford those services? Effective instruction aligned with the science of reading is now usually referred to as structured literacy. We're going to push back on the notion that structured literacy is a one-size-fits-all approach. Adjusting our instruction to serve all children will benefit those at the bottom and middle of the ladder without disadvantaging those at the top. When we look at NAEP results for jurisdictions that have made a concerted effort to move in the direction of structured literacy, we see not only more students moving from below basic to basic, but also students moving from basic to proficient and proficient to advanced. So here's some good news, everyone. We clearly do have a challenge, but the good news is that it is possible to reduce reading failure to less than 5% if we choose to take on the challenge and align our instructional practices with the science of reading. Research has shown that this is possible. Prevention through a strong core program and just-in-time interventions right from the beginning is much more effective than trying to remediate later. And a comment about the 30th percentile. After research-based instruction, the number of first graders reading below the 30th percentile can be as few as 5%. In research terms, that 30th percentile is the low average range, and that's considered to be an acceptable place to be. So with average being on that bell-shaped curve, right? So you want to get kids at least to the 30th percentile, average being the 50th. And as we say with height, it's good to be average, okay? All right, so let's keep going. We need to teach both domains of the simple view of reading, decoding and language comprehension. And we need to cover all strands of the reading rope. So as a reminder again, please do take a look at those first two presentations where we go into much more depth about the simple view of reading, and in the second presentation, the reading rope.
So everyone agrees that teaching the language comprehension strands at the top part of the rope is important, and we probably do need to do a better job. We don't seem to have a situation where there's a lot of dissension about how to teach language comprehension. Maybe it's just that we haven't really thought it through that much, but we do have some definite disagreements about how to teach in the word recognition domain. So that's what we're going to talk about now. One of these three methods of reading instruction, or maybe perhaps more than one of these methods of reading instruction, will be found in your schools. The first method is whole word memorization, and it's just that. It treats reading as a visual process where whole words are learned through repeated exposure without analysis of their sound structure. This approach was very popular in the days of Dick and Jane, but it does continue today in the practice of rote visual memory to learn a body of 100 to 300 high-frequency words either before beginning other reading instruction or alongside other instruction. Then there is a second approach to teaching word recognition, and that is the speech-to-print instruction that builds awareness of speech sounds and connects them to their written representations. It's what we would call a code-based or phonics approach to reading instruction, remembering that all decoded words are ultimately read for understanding in connected text. The third method of teaching word recognition is a multiple strategy method, has its origins in whole language theory, and continues on in balanced literacy programs. What it does is it promotes using a variety of strategies to identify a word, including looking at pictures, thinking about the context that the word is in, looking at the first sound of the word, thinking about the sentence syntax and what type of word would make sense there, and so forth, a variety of strategies. So which one of these strategies, whole word, phonics, or multiple strategy approach, whole language, is most aligned with the science of reading as we've been learning about that science today? The science of reading really only supports the phonics approach, considering that we're not talking about old-fashioned phonics where it's just sound symbol correspondence. We are considering phonics connected with phonemic awareness. So we're talking about going from speech to print. Many of the strategies in the multiple strategies approach are helpful for building language comprehension of text, as we saw in the top half of the rope, but they're not effective for purposes of building word recognition skills that need to develop in the bottom half of the rope. So while children certainly can learn words through both whole word and multiple strategy approaches, those are not efficient approaches. They create bad habits and they create incorrect pathways in the brain. Children who struggle to learn to read and are taught with less efficient models learn compensating habits that are extremely difficult to break, like taking their eyes off the word to check the picture, rather than learning to map the speech to the print. Children who are taught with phonics and a phonemic awareness approach right from the start are able to synthesize their learning much more quickly. One common belief about phonics instruction is that it's one size fits all. This is much too simplistic a statement. All children benefit from explicit phonics instruction. It's the intensity that varies. No child is harmed by explicit phonics instruction, and some children will simply not learn to read at all without that kind of phonics instruction. So I want to repeat though, this is not old-fashioned phonics. It must include phonemic awareness proficiency in order to facilitate storing words in long-term memory for instant access.
It's also important to point out that while we are saying the phonics approach, it's all in the effort to read and understand the text. So that's obviously not the only thing you're doing. You are reading for meaning as you decode those words. Okay.
You're just not using the meaning to decode the words. You're decoding
Exactly.
the words to access the meaning. So,
that's right. That's right.
Think back, if you were in the last presentation thinking about the four-part processor, you know that that connection between sound and symbol that identified the word comes before we move up into the meaning and context parts of the brain. So we want to be sure we're going in the right direction.
That's right. So our goal in teaching word recognition is to have our students build a sight word lexicon that they can recognize automatically, so that they can focus on the meaning of what they are reading. Again, as discussed in our earlier presentation today, the term sight word refers to any word that has been orthographically mapped and can be recognized instantly and automatically. It may appear that this happens through visual memorization of a string of letters or the overall appearance of the word, but in fact, it occurs through working on the connections between the speech sounds in the word and the letters that represent those sounds. It entails building both phonemic awareness and sound correspondence to a proficient level to build fluency, if you will, in those skills, following a predetermined phonics scope and sequence. For a typically developing reader, after a certain amount of teacher-guided work with words of a particular structure, the student is able to self-teach similar words. And for those typical readers, 1 to 4 analytic encounters with the word is really all it takes for it to become orthographically mapped. But for struggling readers, it may take many, many more encounters. as we know, thousands of encounters. Phonics skills are practiced both from print to speech for decoding or reading and from speech to print for encoding or spelling. Skills are practiced both in isolation as well as applied in connected text, and that really needs to happen in the same lesson. When choosing practice text for reading, coordinated decodable text will provide focused practice on those skills that are being learned in your phonics lesson. The type of text you use can facilitate or interfere with the development of orthographic mapping. So you definitely want to consider whether your text is related to your phonics scope and sequence or not. And I've lived in both worlds on that, so I can speak to it directly. In these examples, the blue words can be independently decoded once short vowels and consonants are known. You want 70 to 80% of the text to be decodable at a minimum so that the students are practicing phoneme graphing mapping alongside reading. And again, this is for that beginning to read stage. A large percentage of words in the level text example on the left cannot be decoded by a beginning reader. So it's counterproductive whole word memorization or guessing strategies that would need to come into play. So remember that pathway to create a sight word lexicon is orthographic mapping. Any instructional approach or practice text that pulls the beginning reader's attention away from the phoneme graphing structures of the word will be counterproductive. So let's read Kilpatrick's quote together, if you would. Understanding word recognition development, particularly orthographic mapping, represents the key to unlocking the mystery behind most reading difficulties. And one more time, anything that pulls that reader away from that phoneme grapheme structure will work against that orthographic mapping process. And this isn't our opinion. This has been proven over and over and over again in the scientific studies that we discussed in the first two presentations. So now we're going to take a listen to Stanislas Dehaene one more time, talk about reading in the brain and how it relates, this entire process that we just talked about, how it relates to what happens in your brain. And you can listen to how he says the word pseudo with his very thick French accent. It's kind of fun to hear. We'll listen to a very short, actually about a 5-minute clip of this video. I'm going to scooch up to where we start talking here.
This child is learning to read. He's trying to rewire areas in his brain so it can turn shapes of letters on paper into sounds and words of spoken language. Actually, his teacher might not always be helping him because one common way of teaching probably just makes it harder to learn to read. Stanislas Dehaene knows this. He won the Brain Prize in 2014. He studies how reading takes place in the brain. He is a professor at Collège de France and the leader of INSERM CEA's Cognitive Neuroimaging Center in Saclay, south of Paris. These laboratories are called Neurospin.
In my lab, we are specializing in analyzing the functions of the human brain, and especially the higher level functions such as reading, language, mathematics, number processing, consciousness.
Watching the brain at work requires finely tuned precision scanning instruments, as well as very carefully designed experiments if you want to make sure you're actually studying a certain function of the brain. This means the scientists in Dehaene's laboratory, in order to see how the brain reads, might construct a whole hierarchy of stimuli, ranging from real words all the way down to pseudo words, or even pseudo letters that look like letters but are meaningless symbols in any alphabet.
In this way, we can isolate some of the brain processes by subtraction. We ask, what difference does it make if it's a word? What difference does it make if it's pronounceable? Where in the brain is a specific process going on?
So what actually happens in the brain when it reads? And what implications should it have for how reading should be taught? It turns out our brains build on the circuits we trained when we absorbed spoken language. In other words, to grasp the alphabet, the brain first must learn to speak. That is easy for a child. Over millions of years, evolution has hardwired the human brain structures for that purpose. We don't need to go to school to learn to speak. All we need is to experience a language. But evolution has never shaped the brain to read. No brain structures have been developed through evolution to make sense of letters and written words.
We were never born in order to learn to read. It's an invention, it's very recent. What we do is we recycle some of the circuits of the ventral visual cortex. Some of these circuits are specialized for faces, for instance, but we turn them into circuits for recognizing letters and bringing this information about letters to the same exact circuit that is being used for spoken language. They know about the pronunciation of the word. And especially when you're a beginner reader, the challenge of reading is to turn the letters into sounds.
So that's what this child's brain is struggling with, turning symbols on paper into sounds. Sounds that make sense because they are part of spoken language. But until he masters this conversion, he cannot focus on the meaning of the word.
Now, as you become an expert reader, you become faster and faster in doing this conversion. You begin to be able to do it for an entire set of letters all at once, in parallel. So you no longer have the feeling that you're doing this slow conversion, but it's still going on in your head.
These are findings that have implications for teaching all over the world, because many children are trained to recognize whole words when they learn to read. That might not help the child at all.
Well, there is a debate in the education literature about how to teach reading. There is this idea that maybe you just need to expose children to whole words or even whole sentences and they will absorb the reading system. We know it's not the case, and we know now that it's the other way, the explicit teaching of correspondences between graphemes and phonemes, between letters and sounds, which is the right way to teach reading, because this is the way to teach explicitly those circuits going directly from vision to spoken language. This is the preferred route for the brain. If you don't do that, if you draw attention to the whole word, there are experiments showing that you are teaching another circuit, much more in the right hemisphere, which is, you know, the opposite side of the brain.
Then you're not training the brain to read. The discovery of how the brain learns to read is an example of how scientific measurements of the brain can lead to better understanding of psychological processes like reading, mathematics, and other functions of consciousness. And it turns out...
Whoops.
Okay, so that's Stanislas Dehaene. You know, I just want to say that when we talk about these two different camps in education about how we should teach word recognition, it's, in my mind, it's not really, sometimes it seems it's almost treated like, what toppings do you like on your pizza? You know, well, I like vegetables and my husband likes pepperoni, but reading is not like that. It's not a personal, it shouldn't be personal preference or for personal philosophy about how we teach word recognition. It should come from what the science tells us. So I would love it if science told us that learning to read was very natural and all we had to do was get out some books and we read to the children and we show them the books and they think about the pictures and somehow they learn to read. I would love that. It would be fun, it would be easy for the teacher, it would be easy for the kids, but when I listen to people like Stanislas Dehaene, who won the Brain Prize, I'm going to take my cue from him because he's done the actual research. He shows what goes on in the brain. So as the methods that I am a proponent of for teaching word recognition they don't come from a personal preference or personal philosophy. I base those on what I've learned from reading. And by the way, I love the images of Marilyn Monroe on the wall in his office. That was pretty clever. Okay, so let's think about those two other ways of teaching reading though. So what about whole word memorization? What's wrong with that? Can't we incorporate it into our practice? What if we already teach explicit phonics, but we're just going to add whole word memorization to it? Wouldn't that make it even better? And there are a lot of programs that do exactly this. They'll teach 100 to 300 high frequency words by whole word memorization, usually from flashcards. And they'll do it either before beginning other word recognition instruction or alongside that instruction. And it is possible to memorize a certain number of words by rote visual memory, even though it does take considerable effort, and it will ultimately not result in a sight word lexicon of the size that you need to be a proficient reader. Our ability to memorize whole words is limited to about 5,000 words. It sounds like a lot, but a proficient reader needs 50 to 75,000 words. And if their ability to memorize more new words by sight ends at 5,000, how are they going to get to that level? So despite the jump start that you might think you're getting from whole word memorization at the beginning, students who are taught phonetic decoding right from the beginning will soon outperform whole word memorizers. Another important thing to know about teaching whole word memorization is that brain studies at Stanford have shown that if you present that to a child as their first strategy or first method of figuring out what a word is, you teach them to do whole word memorization, it primes their brain so that down the road, when they come to words they don't know, they're going to approach words in that same way. They're going to try to memorize those words as whole pictures. I've had high school students come in who have been taught whole word memorization, and when I start to work with them and they come to a word they don't know, they stop, they look at me, they ask, I don't know that word yet. And I said, well, let's figure it out. Well, no, I don't know it yet. And what they want is they want me to tell them the word, and then they're going to look at that word and they're going to say it like over and over and over, and they're going to try to get it into their brain through visual memory. But that's not the efficient way to learn to read, and their brains have probably topped out at the number of words that they can learn that way. So reading science suggests that we consider how many of these high frequency words that are often taught early on by rote memory, how many of them are really needed immediately? Shouldn't we explore teaching as many of them as possible through sound symbol correspondence? Had is a very common word. Why don't I just wait until I know that H represents A represents a, and D represents d? Then I can read the word had. Why do I feel I need to teach students to memorize it by rote visual memory? Many of these common words are completely phonetic. They follow phonics patterns that are learned very early on, short vowels and single consonants. And even so-called non-phonetic words usually only have one part of the word that's irregular. It's usually the vowel, and it makes them only slightly more difficult to learn than totally phonetic words. So using this whole word strategy is not really how we want to go. So here are some statistics that show the power of being patient enough to teach the building blocks of words rather than jumping to whole word memorization. If a child memorizes 10 words by sight, he can read 10 words. If a child, though, learns the sounds that are associated with 10 letters, that child can read 350 three-sound words, 4,320 four-sound words, and 21,655 sound words. So we want to put our effort where we're going to get payback for our effort, and that's in learning the sound symbol correspondences, not in memorizing whole words as pictures.
So what about using those multiple strategies for word recognition? If code-based decoding is good, wouldn't it be even better to add additional tools to the toolbox? Many schools do use this approach. These two charts are indications of multiple strategies being used by students for word recognition and by teachers for assessment. Usually the chart in the purple box has cute pictures associated with each line, like an eagle eye or a dolphin, a monkey. So we'll just refer to that as the animal chart. I'm sure you're familiar with these. In the animal chart, really only stretchy snake and perhaps chunky monkey are related to examining the complete sound structure of the word. The other strategies take your eyes off the word and are far less efficient. In the Venn diagram, only looks right is related to examining the orthographic structure of the word. The other strategies are based on language comprehension skills, which, as we saw in the first two sessions, cannot substitute for or create word recognition skills. Word recognition skills start with that sound symbol, not the meaning. Those other skills are important, but they're in that language comprehension domain, and they should be used. They should be used to understand what we read, to check for understanding, not really to decode the words in the first place. What the science of reading has revealed with great clarity is that words only become sight words after they have been orthographically mapped and practiced in context. Solving words as detectives using a variety of context clues is time-consuming. The goal is instant word recognition, not to struggle to figure out the word. This is only accomplished through orthographic mapping. Once a word is mapped, the meaning of the word will be associated with it, and reading comprehension will progress. Poor readers are drawn to whole word memorization, and they're especially drawn to the multiple strategies that take their eyes off the word, because that allows them to avoid developing those phonologic and orthographic processes that are truly difficult. I mean, we all avoid things that are hard for us, so it's no surprise that struggling readers are going to latch on to these strategies, and once they have them, they don't want to let them go, even though they're not really working for them. They're actually slowing down their progress. They're working against progress. The science of reading has shown us that these strategies are exactly what poor readers do to compensate, and not what proficient readers do. The better readers, in fact, figure out early on that efficient reading is accomplished by linking letters and sounds, and they do not use these other strategies for word recognition. For a very good explanation of this, please listen to Emily Hanford's podcast, At a Loss for Words, which is linked in the resources at the end of our handout. And again, remember that the key point we're emphasizing today, as we've talked about the simple view of reading and the reading rope and all the brain imaging studies, language comprehension skills cannot substitute for or create word recognition skills. So what should you do instead? We're going to flip the script here and talk about what are the strategies that could replace those little animal posters. These decoding strategies keep the student's attention on the printed word and connect those speech sounds, which is what children need to do in order to develop their orthographic mapping. So for our new readers, working through a carefully controlled phonics sequence with coordinating decodable text, we can easily use the prompt in the first chart. Point to the word, say the sounds from left to right, blend the word, reread the sentence, and think about the meaning. For older children, we'll ask them to look through the whole word from left to right, but we may also Ask them to notice prefixes or suffixes or vowel teams or the taught written syllable patterns and use this information to help them decode the word. In both cases, after students have decoded that challenging word, we have them go back to reread the sentence for meaning and fluency. And just a note about those decodable texts, there will be some children in your classroom, and I experienced this in my own district, that needed maybe just day 1 and 2 in the decodable text because they were really catching on to patterns quickly. And then the rest of the week, we still continue to teach the phonics and do the work, but they were able to read less decodable stories because of how quickly they acquired the code. So it's not that it's a one-size-fits-all. I just want to give you a concrete example of how you would shift your decodable text use based on the rate in which children are learning the code.
So that teaching of word recognition skills with an alphabetic approach, plus teaching the skills in the language comprehension domain, we've come to know that as structured literacy. And if we accept that structured literacy is the instructional path that will help the most students become proficient readers, we'll want to know exactly what it entails and how to teach it. So we will have in-depth presentations on this later, but here's a summary for today. This is the structured literacy infographic from the International Dyslexia Association, and it shows what we need to teach, the content in the inner ring: phonology, sound symbol correspondence, syllable structures, morphology, syntax, and semantics. And by comparing this with the reading rope, we can see that phonology, sound symbol correspondence, syllables, and morphology are all critical to developing robust word recognition. And in addition, morphology, syntax, and semantics are all important in developing language comprehension. So the outer ring in this infographic covers the pedagogical practices that are supported by evidence. We need to teach explicitly rather than leave important concepts for self-discovery by our students. We need to teach systematically with a preset scope and sequence that moves from simple to complex, from common to unusual, rather than just providing random mini lessons. We need to teach cumulatively so that new concepts are linked to previously taught material and continuous review is provided, rather than assuming that what is taught is learned the first time. And finally, we need to be diagnostic. We need to track our student progress through informal and formal assessment to pick up any problems while there's still time to intervene and prevent long-term trouble. We need to be able to differentiate based on student need.
Okay. So if you've not seen structured literacy in practice, here's a handy comparison slide setting typical literacy practices alongside structured literacy practices. A printable version can be found at breakingthecode.com. So Mary and I are going to read these with you. Mary's going to read the typical side, I'm going to read the structured side, and you can get a flavor for the differences between the two. Ready?
Yeah, that assumes that I can make this big enough. Okay, here we go. Okay, so for a typical reader, talking about a typical literacy program, talking about phonemic awareness is covered haphazardly or it's not covered at all.
Whereas in a structured literacy environment, phonemic awareness it's emphasized as a pre-reading skill, and it usually opens a lesson.
For phonics, for the full range of sound letter correspondences is assumed to be learned naturally, and phonetic patterns are covered unsystematically and in context.
Whereas in a structured literacy classroom, the phonics instruction would be explicit, systematic instruction on the full range of sound letter correspondence, beginning with simple patterns and proceeding to more complex ones. It's difficult to do this without a program. Keep going.
And then we'll look at those high frequency words or words that are not completely phonetic. And in the typical classroom, memorization of a Dolch or Fry list, which sometimes called sight words, with little or no attention to their phonetic components is what we find.
So you might see a lot of flashcards in that situation. Whereas in a structured literacy classroom, we'd have high frequency words taught according to their phonetic pattern, and irregular words would be analyzed for the element that doesn't match what the kids have been taught. So think about the word said. How would you approach teaching the vowel sound in said when it doesn't match the letters? There would be a systematic and explicit routine used to approach the teaching of those irregulars. Okay.
And then when we're working on our decoding, and we're looking at for word identification of words that we come across in our text, and we're stumped on a word, in a typical classroom, we're going to focus at most on the first or the last letter of the word. And then we're going to have heavy reliance on context clues, including pictures.
So you'll hear teachers say things like, what would make sense in that sentence? Whereas in a structured literacy classroom, when the students come to a word they don't know, the first prompt would be look through the word, sound out the word, finger underneath. And there would be a letter sound association happening. Context clues would be used to help you to identify a highly irregular word in the context of that sentence, or to clarify meaning. So context does play a role, but it's after you've made the attempt to decode the word.
So then what happens when we have students who misread words as they go through? In a typical literacy or balanced literacy situation, misread words are generally ignored as long as they don't seriously interfere with comprehension. So you see the example of a student reading a word, and that the word, a word in a sentence is house, but they substitute the word home. And in a typical balanced literacy classroom, you would just ignore that because they basically have the same meaning, even though their phonetic structure is different.
Whereas in a structured literacy environment, corrections are done immediately. So when a student makes a mistake, the teacher calls the attention to that word and they analyze the word. Now, what is said varies based on the child and what the student knows. But the point is that immediate corrective feedback loop is provided. The student has to sound out the word again and then start the sentence over. And the teacher will provide the appropriate cues to help them figure out the word. So immediate corrective feedback, huge in a structured literacy environment.
And then we look at what type of text, what type of connected text are children reading in the classroom. And in a typical literacy classroom, we see a lot of repetitive, predictable, leveled readers that contain unlearned phonetic patterns. And when we have that situation, the student's left with they have two options basically. They can ask someone what the word is, or they can guess. And so it encourages those guessing strategies or trying to memorize whole words by sight. Because there are too many words in the text that they cannot actually decode yet.
Well, and then with the younger, with those level A, B, and C books, the hardest word, the one that's not decodable, is usually in the picture. So then the book itself reinforces looking away from the word to check the picture. So we don't necessarily, pictures aren't a bad thing. We want kids to enjoy the illustrations in books, but really it's to add to the meaning, not to figure out the words. So in a structured literacy classroom, the use of decodable readers would definitely be available and used, especially in primary situations and in intervention. And those decodable readers would contain the patterns that had been taught. So it's progressively or cumulatively decodable text that aligns with your scope and sequence. You can have other books available, but it's after you've used those decodables. Go ahead.
One of the misconceptions that I see sometimes about decodable text is that as long as you pull a book from a decodable series, it must be fine. But the decodable series run over a range. They're in a scope and sequence. So the book that you're choosing has to match where your student is in that scope and sequence. And this all points out to why it's so important for reading to listen to beginning readers read aloud rather than just send them off into the corner or to their desk to read independently. So that leads me to the last bullet point here. How much time in your class is devoted to independent reading? And we know that independent reading, wide reading, is really important. We want our kids to engage in that type of activity, but how much of our class time are we spending on that? And in a typical balanced literacy classroom, we'll spend quite a bit of class time having the children do independent reading, usually silent reading, where no one knows whether they're reading correctly or not.
So, right, so that in the sister's language, that would be the read to self experience, right? Whereas in a structured literacy classroom, we still do want children to read, but in place of that read to self time, it might be reading to a partner, reading with the teacher. There's going to be significant time devoted to reading with someone versus independent reading, much less time devoted to that. All right. We hope that helps clarify some details for you. So implementing the science of reading is not a linear, simple process. It's not clean, it's not linear, there is not a one-size-fits-all. How do we do that? How do we move towards a structured literacy design? Well, first, it begins with small changes. And it really depends on that poll that you filled out earlier in this session, asking you where you are and what locus of control you have. So these are my words of advice, having lived this process more than once and having observed it, where it has succeeded and where it has fallen short. Those small changes that you make have a tremendous impact. And if your locus of control is only what happens in your classroom, that's a great place to start. Start with those correction procedures. Swap out the animal poster with one of the many options available on Pam Kastner's bookmarks for decoding Padlet, which I think we have linked in our handouts. And it requires a growth mindset. You have to be willing and able to challenge your own beliefs about how reading should be taught, and to be willing to let go of practices that that we know now are not as effective, and not to feel bad about that, but just to let them go and say, okay, now I know something different, and I'm going to replace that practice with this one because I want to move all of my kids forward. And I didn't even realize that some of the things I was doing were actually holding some of my students back. So maintain a growth mindset and be kind to yourself. Lots of ongoing professional learning is absolutely critical as well. This cannot be done, as you all know. You're here today on a summer day when you could be doing lots of other things. You're here learning more about the science of reading, so hats off to you. I assembled this next slide, and these are, again, not in any particular order, but these are things as I was thinking about how do you implement the science of reading. In the middle, it really requires a long-term and ongoing investment in professional learning. You need a plan. You need a 5-year plan, whether that's your own personal 5-year plan on the things you're going to do, or if you're at the district level, how can we make changes and bring people along on the way? Nobody likes to be forced into change. So how do you encourage change amongst your colleagues? I know that it's hard. I know that it is. It's imperative to have ongoing coaching support. So if you commit to this, who are your mentors? Maybe your mentors are people on an online community that you log into and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. Or maybe you're in a situation where you have coaching support provided in your district and you seek out that person for whom you know is on this journey as well, and you get more coaching from them. It's imperative that you look at your materials and your assessments. There is no perfect program. Okay, I know that we all want it. There are ones that are way better than others, but there is not one single perfect one. There will be something not quite right about every one of them. But the point is to look at what you have and then decide, maybe we need to scrap all of this because this is just not aligned at all. Or maybe we need to add a phonics scope and sequence with a line decodable text and maintain our library of rich read alouds and so forth. So really assess where you are in that materials realm, and don't be afraid to make changes from that, because it will slow your progress if you are conservative with the changing out of your materials. Same with the assessments. Are your assessments aligned? Some assessments that we do take us away from the science, and some of them directly align with diagnostic teaching. So we will offer a session down the road where we dig into what those assessments look like. And then look at your schedule. Do you have enough time? Do you have enough time to balance whole group and small group? I came from a district where we spent lots and lots of time in small group instruction and had no whole group. And then we purchased a program, and everyone suddenly did all whole group, and that wasn't working either. So you have to have this balance of whole group and small group and in the right amount of instructional minutes. It's a process, it's a journey. Okay, that's a lot of information. You've got this slide, digest it, take the time to think through where you are and what your logical next step is. And you want to do that because teaching reading through this equity lens demands that we understand the science behind how children learn to read, so that we may all effectively serve the children in our classrooms, all of them, not just some, not just the high, not just the kids who will learn no matter what, but all the children. Okay, Mary, we've made it to our slides that talk about the materials.
Okay, let's do that quickly here. So we have, we've put together some resources for you, and I hope it's helpful the way that we've organized them under different topics. You can see on the first slide, we have sources that you can look at for the importance of reading. What is the importance of reading to students? What's the importance of reading for teachers? And what's the importance for society? I just wanted to mention something. You know, teachers put in so much work every day, so do tutors. They just, you know, they work until they're exhausted. And sometimes the results that they're getting from their students don't match the effort that they put in. And I heard somebody say once that the scientific definition of the term work, when you're looking at physics, you have to have an outcome from it. So if you are working, but you're just spinning your wheels because you're working in an ineffective way to teach reading, you're not really doing what physics calls work. You've done it and you haven't accomplished any work. So we want to make what our students learn reflect the effort that we've put in to planning our lessons and teaching them. The next slide has the Emily Hanford podcasts on it. And we've mentioned these in our previous presentations today. Especially if you want to learn about the multiple cueing strategies and how it encourages readers to use poor reader strategies, look at A Loss for Words. It focuses on that strategy and programs that teach that strategy. And then so excited for the day after tomorrow to hear her new podcast. So if the term podcast kind of sends you into a tizzy, I know sometimes when I hear these things, I go, podcast, what's that? How do I access a podcast? Just go to APM Educate online and you can find Emily Hanford, and you can have a little button there and you click on it and you can listen to it. So it's not really as mysterious as it might sound. These next resources delve into looking at the NAEP Data Explorer to figure out how we can analyze our data. One of our members of our board of directors, Steve Dykstra, has done a webinar that's available on Voyager Socris, and it's about using the NAEP Data Explorer to pull out data for your jurisdiction. Then there are some other resources here that talking about aligning with structured literacy and the difference on this page, differences between orthographic mapping and the differences between instruction that encourages orthographic mapping versus instruction that uses multiple cueing. And then see if I can get to these. Here are these books. We've had these up at our other presentations, and these all make really great additions to your library. And if you're looking to make systems change within your school or your district, we would recommend reading The Knowledge Gap and Speech to Print as giving you some strategies of how to talk to colleagues in your district. So please do stay in touch with us. We are Reading League Wisconsin. Now, sometimes people get confused. We are a state chapter of a national organization called the Reading League. Our logo looks just like theirs, except that ours says Wisconsin on it. And so our email addresses are similar, and people get confused, but we are a separate organization. Obviously, we support each other, but we are a separate nonprofit headquartered in Wisconsin. So stay in touch with us through email or Facebook or Twitter. Coming up September 1st, we are supposed to have a page on our National Reading League website, so that if you go to the readingleague.org in September, you should be able to click on state chapters and get a list of things that we're doing here. But try, find one of these ways, Twitter, Facebook, email, website, to keep track of what we're doing. Amy and I are sort of science of reading evangelists, so we're always wanting to share this information and spread it on. We also would like to encourage you to look at our parent organization, the Reading League, which has been around longer than we have, and they have an excellent website, lots of resources on there that you can access, list of decodable readers. They have a YouTube channel. Check them out, because a lot of times, rather than posting everything through our own social media, we'll just say, look at the Reading League. They've already put this information out there, so make use of that. So we want to thank you for staying in touch with us, and this completes the recording for this session. And if you're attending live, please stay on for a few more minutes. We have about 10 minutes where we're going to do some questions and answers.